Hello, I'm the Angry Spork. Marvel stunned readers a couple of years back when they actually killed off everyone's favorite X-Man, Wolverine. Well, stunned might be exaggerating it a bit. When it comes to comics, death is kind of like a case of the sniffles. It happens to just about everyone, and it doesn't last too long. And it didn't last long for him either. Longer than I would have thought. Though, this was not the first time Wolverine bit the dust. I'm taking issue with the first death of Wolverine, starting with the 3-part series Astonishing X-Men. Let's start with issue number 1 and see if this comic makes us want to turn the page or turn our heads. Story and art by Howard Mackey, Brandon Peterson, Tim Townsend, and Dan Panosian, with colors by Liquid. The cover sees a different, smaller roster.
The studio couldn't afford another X-Men.
From the ashes of the shattering. I kind of wonder if Phoenix takes any offense to the use of the word ashes. Anyway, we begin in a top-secret containment complex in New Mexico, designed to imprison just one guy, the cyborg Bastion. Before this, he was carrying out plans to exterminate all mutants, but now he's getting analyzed by the very scientists who used to call him boss, who also apparently shop at the same off-brand sunglass hut as Scott Summers. Bastion senses an intruder. Narration doesn't say how, but since he's part Sentinel, it could be assumed that he detects mutancy. But it has to be assumed. This one intruder in particular is making him extra fearful, demanding to be released or none of them will survive. Guards in really weird armored suits get taken down one by one, until we get a splash page of their assailant. He is death. He will not be stopped this night, until he has that which he seeks. Did anyone call for an Uber? Come on, guys, I've already demolished 2 other secret government bases tonight. I really need this fare. And is it just me, or does that skull belt buckle look like it has pupils? Like it's just trying to ignore everything going on and it's kind of embarrassed? Anyway, we get a page that introduces us to Warren Worthington III, Archangel, Cable, also known as Nathan Summers, who's just really looking at that spear, I don't know, and half a world away, Nate Gray, potentially the greatest psionic power on Earth. You can tell he's young and hip because he's snowboarding. What force could possibly unite 3 such different men? Well, considering Nate is just a teenage version of Cable from the Age of Apocalypse reality, I wouldn't say they're too different. Jean Grey, also known as Phoenix, calls to each of them, saying that Professor Xavier has disbanded the X-Men, leaving only herself, Cyclops, and Wolvie. A little girl named Nina, one of a group of children called Manites, sent out a telepathic SOS and had no one else to turn to. A short time later, the 3 remaining X-Men wait next to the Blackbird, outside the Xavier school, when the rest of the party arrives, with Cable getting the drop on Logan. Old Knucklehead just attributes it to the shakeup of the prof ending the team. I think he's just preoccupied with all the stuff he still has on the DVR and wondering if Xavier's just going to delete it all by the time he gets back home. Wolvie is on so many teams at the same time, he has so much Downton Abbey to catch up on. Scott explains that the Manites are largely a mystery to them, possibly the result of government experimentation, but they do know that Nina in particular is extraordinarily powerful. She and her friends are being pursued by someone, and they have their coordinates logged into the plane's navigator ready to go. Cable seems pensive, as if the situation is more dangerous than it seems, but he can't really put a cybernetic finger as to why. After an hour, Cyclops is double-checking that they have the right place, because their coordinates have brought them to the Hulkbuster base. It was not only the home of Bastion's Operation Zero Tolerance before it became his prison, it was also where Scott and Jean were imprisoned, so he's not too happy to revisit it. They land to inspect the base, Jean noting that there aren't even traces of the minds of those who were previously here. And since they don't seem to see any bodies, I guess death just threw them somewhere? Wolvie says he'll take point while Warren scouts from above, with Cyclops' permission. Wolverine asking Cyclops for permission instead of just doing his own thing anyway? I'm gonna have to double check to make sure this isn't a what-if story. Cable asks Logan why he stuck around after the X split, and he explains that he just has no other family besides the team and didn't want to abandon Psyche and Jean when things looked bad. But enough of all that, it's on with the investigation. Jean is questioning bringing Nate into their world, but Scott thinks that at least now he has a chance of being a part of something bigger than himself, aside from the fact that they might need his immense power. He might be powerful, but it's hard to take him seriously with that face. Yeesh. I can't tell if he's trying to do a mocking impression of Wolvie or if half his face just suddenly fell asleep. Warren confirms there's no one else around, just as Jean detects faint brainwave activity, so Scott cuts loose with his optic blasts to clear the heavy debris blocking the entrance. Just as an evil presence is felt, the floor and walls begin moving, according to Cable, as if manipulated on a molecular level. They're being psionically controlled, Cable.
You think he would have caught on to that? Since he's psionic himself, and supposedly none too shabby at it either? I guess everyone's off their game today.
Wolverine finds the culprit, a kid that looks like if you spliced Beast Boy's DNA with that of the Hulk villain The Leader, and warns him to put down his gun. And X-Man is just leading back, taking it all in. Way to contribute to the team, Nate. Nina rushes in and tells the kid, Headcase, that the X-Men are there to help, and she takes them to see the rest of the Manites. Though they'd previously escaped from the base, they returned because the world overwhelmed them and they wanted more familiar surroundings, hidden from everyone else above. Another presence is sensed down a corridor, but Nina warns them not to go. There's a bad man down there. Jean, sensing fear and pain, won't let harm come to the children, but they have to see if someone needs help. A couple minutes later, they find Bastion. Well, what's left of him. And he's either being sustained or only suspended by wires, I can't tell, which is extra surprising since the X-Men were told he was destroyed. Noticing a couple of the kids, the Man-Borg gets all cryptic about how much more powerful than mutants the Manites are, how they'll inherit the Earth as the next stage of evolution, and how Bastion saved them when they were written off as failures. His talk is upsetting the little girl, so it's decided they'll look for her friends and grab Bastion on their way out.
Now there's some wacky thinking for you. Bastion hates mutants so much he wants them all eradicated. But these kids that dwarf the power of mutants, he wants to keep around? I guess you could say he thought he could control them, mold them into adults that follow his orders and his ideals, but it still seems rather head-scratching to me.
Logan figures he can fulfill Nina's request of making the bad man stop talking, preeminent-like, but Psyche stops him with the old "we aren't as bad as our enemy" spiel. Nina senses someone else closing in and insists they find the others fast, so they leave Bastion to be cryptic again, but with more self-preservation and panic. Before long, they reach a solid titanium door that Nina opens a portal through, to the rest of the Manites. Just in time, because the one that's after them manages to dent that door. You know, the one made of titanium. Weird how Scott says he's slicing through it, when it's clearly a concussive impact, not lacerate. X-Man added some telekinetic reinforcement so Jean and the others can get the kids to safety, while Cyclops and Cable go back for Bastion. Fortunately, one Manite has the ability to project a schematic telling them exactly where to go.
That's right. Each of these kids has multiple superpowers convenient for any given situation. Coming this fall to the CW, it's Plot Convenience Kids.
Their pursuer somehow hits the door with enough force to knock Nate out. At least, that's what Jean says. And one of the kids, Grace, activates the base's self-destruct, and she can't deactivate it, even though there could be others trapped in the compound. Jean seems to be eyeing the reader like, what, are you blaming us, or are you expecting us to do something? Anyway, she informs her husband of the elevated threat, and he still wants to go get Bastion, only to find he's gone.
Dang it! That was the last evil cyborg head they had in stock. I knew I should have pre-ordered on Amazon.
Nate's back on his feet, saying he can't hold up his barrier much longer, and it's kind of weird because when Jean said Nate was down, it made it seem like he was unconscious or something. The panels can get so small and cluttered, it's hard to get a sense of what's going on beyond what they seem to have to describe in dialogue. Anyway, Phoenix has Nina open up a portal to the outside while Scott and Cable blast their way to an emergency tunnel, with the latter TKing their way up. Some blasted how, Nina and the X-Men make it through the portal to the Blackbird, but the other Manites wound up somewhere else after going through the same portal.
Maybe Nina's portals work like the interstate, and the Manite kids just took the first off-ramp they saw had a McDonald's.
There aren't any more people left in the facility, so there's no ethical quandary in the mutants boarding their plane and hauling out as the Hulkbuster base gets busted. And out from the rubble rises Death, holding Bastion's head in such a way that begs for a Hamlet reference.
But I won't make that reference, because this story should have more self-respect than to beg.
You don't actually know anything about Hamlet, do you, brah?
Shut up.
Issue number 2, with a cover that features the new Horseman attacking the X-Man that once had his job.
Death meet death. Death meet death. I'm sure you both have a lot to talk about.
As narration recaps the previous events, the Blackbird gets caught in the explosion's resultant electromagnetic pulse, killing the nav computer and stalling the controls. Wolvie can land it, but only with the 3 telekinetics on board holding it in one piece. Then there's this weird panel. Nina hasn't said anything, but Wolverine tells her to calm down, only for the girl to interrupt him saying, "Death is here!" It's just awkward without some kind of exclamation of terror from her for Logan to respond to. Oh, and Death is there, somehow ahead of them and firing a pillar of energy? It's Death! He's a bad man!
All he did was kill a bunch of people and destroy an entire military base. Being a little judgmental, aren't we?
They manage a landing they can walk away from, and Psyche starts giving out orders, setting up recon and defenses in anticipation of their foe. Jean, meanwhile... Jean-while? She mind links with Nina to get a better understanding of the Manites, and... I guess inside her head Nina looks like a pink phalanx. They connect with the other kids, but they're afraid that the X-Men will fear them once they find out who their parents are and what they'll become. The link is severed when Nina mentions a changing, and says that they have to find the others now. I guess Death took a coffee break or 4, because Jean has time for exposition. As suspected, the Manites were laboratory created, and Death wants them, well, dead. So, with the plane kaput at the moment, the team needs to split. Jean, Wolvie, and Nate go with Nina to find her siblings, while Cable and Warren stay behind with Psyche, who's always got his rapport with Jean to stay in touch in an emergency. Then, GAH!
Ah, the art style changed so drastically it gave my eyes whiplash. If I didn't have these shades, I'd probably be blinded right now.
Team Find Them Youngins arrives at a strangely quiet carnival, finding some of the rides covered in a strange material that's breaking down plastics and metal. Oh, and some people are trapped in it too, and they could be next. Nina says this is part of the changing, a metamorphic phase in the Manites that is different for each of them. X-Man begins thinking their pursuit of the kids is just like his life from his own timeline, thinking the Manites should make their own choices. Jean clarifies that they're not hunting the kids, but trying to help them so they can learn to control their powers. But Nate still doesn't see the difference.
Nate Gray is a moron.
This particular changing is being experienced by Darko, and with the chaos it's causing, Wolvie and Gray are on board with taking the rest of the kids and hightailing it. But Jean can see the pain Darko is going through and won't leave him, despite the danger. His experience is not unlike what mutants go through when their powers first surface. We pop over to Archangel Cyclops and his future son, musing on how little they know about their opponent when they stumble upon Bastion, who becomes slightly less cryptic than before, saying they haven't been tracking Death, he's been baiting them!
Wait, is Death an internet troll? Man, that's not intimidating at all. Though it does kind of make sense that he's menacing small children, trying to pick fights he thinks he can win.
Somehow, in his short time with the Horsemen, Bastion's been illuminated on how supremely prepared he is for each of the X-Men. Just as Cable links Scott's mind with Warren, Rich Boy is surprised by their enemy. Talk about death from above. At the carnival, Wolverine notes his admiration for Jean's compassion, but since his is significantly more limited, he's seriously considering putting Darko down his way to save the innocents. So Phoenix asks for access to the other Manites' minds, so she can learn more about them and the changing. Darko's powers involve absorbing inorganic and organic matter to convert to energy, but now it's requiring more than normal, with the tendrils acting as defense. Probing deeper into the kids' origins, Jean reaches an epiphany just before being grabbed. Even as X-Man saves her, he seems to need to describe the fact that the tendrils are absorbing her more quickly and he needs to act fast. And then she's freed a couple panels later. Exposition is doing a lot of legwork in this story. Wolvie reasserts his intention to attack the Source, but a newly freed Jean calls him off, knowing what to do. But first, back to the desert, where Death apparently disappeared before their eyes. I guess while Logan was threatening to kill a child. They reason that the cloaked figure was using some kind of cloaking device, one strong enough to elude Cable's psi probes. And that's when Warren falls from the sky.
Now wait, let's not jump to conclusions here. He normally flies like a bird, right? Well, maybe all of a sudden he decided he wanted to know what it was like to fly like a rock. You know, rich people, they always have these weird idiosyncrasies.
He mutters that Death was toying with him, and that he wants something from the X-Men as well as the Manites. Cable notices Scott raising his visor and asks why, because apparently he too is a moron. And I guess they thought that this was really dramatic, even though we can see who he's shooting at on the same page. Making matters worse, Death blocks it with his sword, which should be kind of impossible, what with Summers being powerful enough to destroy mountains if he wanted to, and it doesn't look like this guy was so much as nudged. Physics alone... Moving on. Jean's discovered that the Manites share mental and physical bonds. Their minds are as different from ours as we are from the dolphins.
So when Manites take their place as leaders of the New World Order, does that mean mutants will be kept in water parks and made to perform tricks for tiny fish?
With Logan on physical defense and Nate on telepathic defense, Jean focuses solely on Darko, while aided by Nina. Phoenix tells the boy not to be afraid of what's happening. The changing is natural, and his fear is making it more painful than it needs to be. It calms the boy down enough that he enters the next natural step for the Manites, a chrysalis that helps their powers fully develop, though it's up in the air what that will result in. Father and son are barely holding their own against their mysterious foe, so Scott uses his report to contact Jean, which is Death's cue to disappear. Somehow he managed to use a psychic connection between Phoenix and her hubby to locate them and just vanishes. Now, much of this is presumed by the X-Men, but you could say they're drawing a logical conclusion to a certain extent. Next time they face him, they'll have to alter their strategies, since he seemed to know their skills pretty well. They hop on board the Blackbird, which is working now, I guess, and they take off to the rest of the team. Along for the ride, not having bought a ticket, is Death.
He could have found a way inside the plane, but the in-flight movie was going to be X-Men Origins Wolverine, and he'd rather risk falling off a plane at high speed 6 miles in the air.
The final issue's cover features Death grasping some fabric with an X symbol on it. I'm not entirely sure what that's supposed to belong to, though, and he's surrounded by the still costumed skeletons of 3 X-Men, with another skeleton reflected in his blade.
Oh, come on, that skeleton is naked. This isn't that kind of show, you pervs.
Everyone's gathered around Darko's cocoon like it's a drum circle, recapping previous events and waiting on the 3 absent X-Men. And there's the Blackbird, heading for the ground and hemorrhaging a trail of smoke.
Who didn't put their tray in the upright position? We have these rules for a reason, people!
Turns out Cable and Archangel are battling Death on the plane. It's kind of surprising, since you'd think a guy that was previously eluding them so easily up to now would have gone unnoticed until they landed, but this issue surprises you by having him be discovered. Off-panel and not really explained how. Not exactly sure when they were supposed to have discovered he was on the plane, but it would have made sense to, fly somewhere else other than where he wants you to take him. Anyway, after Scott and Warren somehow have a quick chat about landing that they shouldn't be able to have, one outside the plane while it's traveling at high speed, no indication of comm devices, Cable gets knocked off, which horrifies Jean because, as narration notes, she can't help him, leaving it to Worthington to get his rescue on.
This just doesn't make sense to me. How many times have I read in an X-Men comic that Jean was considered not only a very powerful telepath, but probably the best telekinetic force on the planet? What exactly is keeping her from keeping her son from becoming a pavement pancake? It feels more like they wanted to briefly dabble in some maternal agony, but in order to do that, they have to basically ignore Jean's development from the past several years.
Death is about to skewer Scott, but he didn't count on Phoenix psychically telling him to optic blast the roof of the plane. She then asks X-Man for help. The plane can't be saved even with their combined telekinetic powers. I'm guessing that's either an error that slipped past the editors, or Jean had a brief flashback to a time when she was a spokeswoman for Doublemint Gum. Anyways, they have to slow the descent of the craft while Scott goes limp. Somehow, Death blocks Jean's psi link with Scott, and she senses something familiar yet horrible about him. The bird crashes, Nate shielding everyone from the debris, and Jean nabbing Scott. A short time later, they're investigating the crash, specifically what looks like Death's cloak. Psyche wants to leave before the police arrive to take the Manites into custody, and figures no one could have survived, and because sons just have to contradict their fathers, Cable mentions that a Horseman of Apocalypse would have been just fine, even though according to editor Mark Powers, Pocky is deader than a cold doornail. I promise.
Because if he died in a comic book, you know it's gonna stick.
And I kind of find it funny that this word bubble that no one could have possibly survived that crash is right next to a guy with a healing factor, who probably could have. Not to mention, the southern woman with super strength, or the Russian that can turn into metal. Nate Gray is a bit set off at the mention of En Sabah Nur, what with living in a reality where he ruled the planet. Nina joins in, saying that she and her siblings can sense that Death is still around. A ponderous claim, since 3 resident telepaths can't sense the villain, but Jean thinks there are some things about the Manites that remain unknown, even to themselves. They might even be able to pose some kind of threat to someone as powerful as Apocalypse. Wolvie finds himself a souvenir, Death's blade, but just then the telepaths are all psychically attacked, and Logan is pulled beneath the rubble as Death rises again. Wolverine!
Is no more.
So, I guess that wasn't his cloak we were looking at earlier?
One of the problems with the art in this miniseries is that while the characters are drawn very well for the most part, sometimes environmental details are bland and indistinct, or given very, very little panel focus. It feels like the panels are all congested and cluttered, but we get very little detail as to the surroundings these characters are supposed to be in.
Jean repeats that Death is after the children, like we don't already know that, but Scott is done running and prepared to fight. X-Man is all for that, but his older counterpart warns him of the folly of attacking while blinded by anger, even if their foe works for Apocalypse. Cyclops goes full force with his optic blast, not letting up, but it doesn't work. Not even Death's clothes are damaged as he knocks one eye aside.
A force that can destroy mountains is nothing compared to a cloak and some funky tribal armor. Such is the power of mighty Apocalypse!
After Archangel is thrown down with an illusion that the Master has plans for him later, Jean, who has again been described as one of the more powerful psionic talents on Earth, says she can't hope to stand up to Death, but can buy time for Nate and Cable to stand a chance, so she unleashes a neat-looking telekinetic groundswell, then fall down go boom.
The Phoenix unleashing her telekinetic fury on a Horseman of Apocalypse doesn't feel as epic as I think it should. I don't know if it's because of the congested feeling I mentioned earlier, something that's present throughout the series, Or maybe that for all the talk of how dangerous death is, he doesn't feel like that huge a threat when he just knocks people out most of the time. And maybe it's also because immediately after she attacks, Jean Dunn gets the vapors and is at the enemy's mercy. And that only has to happen because the story needs to move along.
Jean wants to know who her executioner is, sensing familiarity in his eyes.
Now that you mention it, he does look a lot like a Jawa on steroids. It's almost like the comic predicted that both Star Wars and Marvel would one day be owned by the same company.
But after his moment's hesitation, Death turns from her and approaches Nate, Cable, and the kids. And that's when Wolverine returns from nowhere, going full berserker and giving his team time to get the Manites to safety. Though, if you look closely at his face, his upper lip is drawn really hilariously weird, almost like it was a caricature gag from Teen Titans. A lot of red cloth gets snagged in his claws until Death strikes him down. It's not overly graphic. We get a close-up of the blade with some of Wolfie's suit in tatters, then him grasping his gut. I thought maybe he was run through by the blade, but there doesn't seem to be any damage to the back of his suit, or blood on the blade itself, though it does all of a sudden have a black aura around it, so I don't know what that means. Jean races to him, sensing no brainwave activity, and decides Death himself is going to die. But he easily blocks her mental attack with his blade, because why should things make sense? It's at this moment that Nina informs everyone that Darko has completed his change, though we don't see him, and he has a plan, one that requires the psionic X-Men's help. Together they create a big lens flare or something. Then Death decides the Manites are worthy to survive and then pieces out.
Honestly, I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking at on that panel. 3 powerful psychics and a bunch of kids with immense untapped potential create a mundane-looking sunset, and that's evidence enough for this horseman to say they're worth surviving for now? It just yada-yada's the threat this guy posed, but that's not all the yada-yada, because we've still got one more page.
Nina figures that now Darko can take care of the Manites, as the rest of them go through their own changes. She thanks them for the X-Men's help and leaves with her siblings without even a "sorry your hairy Canadian died." She's one "okay, I love you, bye-bye" from being Mindy from Animaniacs. Not that the last 2 panels are much better. It seems unbelievable that Logan would die, given his healing factor, but die he did, so that the children would live, and Apocalypse will answer for their loss. The X-Men know that now their lives will never be the same.
Who will be the spotlight in our merchandising now? So that was Astonishing X-Men numbers 1 through 3. And wow, did it need some serious patchwork.
The pacing can be shaky, kind of all over the place at times. Background elements are prone to being indistinct and vague, with no impression on the reader. It tells when it should show sometimes, leaving some sequences kind of confusing, like when Nate is knocked back, Jean acts like he's unconscious, then he's back up again. And too often it crams things into every panel instead of giving some moments the space they need. There's very little breathing room in moments like Jean attacking with everything she's got, and most of the fights in general, they don't really seem that exciting. And the character death they advertised at the end of issue 2, and probably the most popular X-Man ever, doesn't feel like it has any gravity to it. It didn't feel weighty when I first read it years ago, either. Perhaps part of it is the scene where he gets attacked and Jean seems to instantly know the wound is fatal, somehow. I'm not sure how she could, since she knows he's got a healing factor. A devastating reaction would have made more sense after Logan failed to get up and she couldn't sense any brainwaves.
It certainly didn't help that much of the fighting seemed pretty dull. I get they can only do so much with still images, but I've seen comics before and after this that have featured better fights without having to explain or excuse things through dialogue. The visuals never really convinced me this was someone that countered the X-Men so easily because he knew their moves oh so well.
It reads like a 4-part story stretched out to 6 or 7 and then squeezed all into 3 issues, if that makes any sense. Not to mention that normally powerful characters give their all, and it doesn't do anything against this one guy because he's a horseman. I know they get powered up and everything, but this feels like it was just some unsuccessful dramatic tension. He seems to just materialize new powers as he needs them to beat the X-Men but not actually live up to his name. Though Jean talking down Darko was a good mentor moment for her, making the changing, much like mutancy itself, analogous to puberty as she tells him he's got nothing to fear from his biology. So, one nice moment. Way to go.
And at the end of the day, there's still an evil cyborg head just lying around in a New Mexico desert. Guess the writers just plain forgot about old Bastion. But this review isn't quite over yet, as there are more revelations to be had next week. I'm the Angry Spork, and man, have I got issues.